They told me from a young age that I was born to be the hope of many. I carried that weight on fragile shoulders before I even understood what it meant to have no choice. My world was made of heavy tapestries, corridors too long, halls that echoed, emptier than any deserted forest. I was beautiful, they said. I was betrothed, they said. I was necessary. It was never about who I was, but what I represented, a chess piece carefully carved to be moved by invisible hands. I grew up learning how to smile without promising, speak without revealing, remain silent without seeming submissive. And I learned well, so well that for a long time I was the perfect shadow of the princess they wanted me to be, polished on the outside, suffocated within. But on stormy nights, when candle flames flickered without warning in golden chandeliers, something in me trembled too, something untamed, something that hadn't learned to bow. It was in that cutting silence, in that carefully choreographed life, that the rumor arrived, not as a shout, but as subtle poison seeping through the palace walls. Rebels, they said, savages who dared question the order, the law, the tradition. My father, the governor of our lands, snarled his contempt at their mention, as if their mere existence was a personal affront to the blood in our veins. We were taught to despise them before we even knew their names, and I should have done so. I should have felt disgust, fear, repulsion. But instead, a restlessness grew within me, so alive it almost hurt. Who were they? Where did they find such courage, such fury? What world did they see that I couldn't glimpse through the polished glass windows encasing my existence? When the rebellion became impossible to ignore, councillors, generals, and leaders from neighboring lands gathered, their brows furrowed, their words steeped in barely disguised fear. I watched from my place in the shadows, as always, listening without being heard, learning that the empire built around me wasn't as solid as its gilded walls suggested. And when my father summoned me, the order came with the same coldness. He used to seal documents or sign treaties. I was to be sent as an emissary to negotiate peace, a peace that, in truth, would be the rebels' silent surrender or their disguised condemnation. My mission was to smile, promise, distract, while the troops tightened their siege. That night, alone in my chambers, I touched the gilded frame of the mirror, staring at the image of the princess they had molded. And for the first time, I felt repulsion, not for the world outside, but for what I had become without ever fighting. I asked myself, with painful clarity, if I had ever truly chosen anything for myself, and in the silent doubt that echoed as dawn fell like a veil over the palace towers, a part of me, fragile but stubborn, began at last to awaken. The morning I departed was heavy with fog, as if the world itself hesitated to let the mission begin. Mounted on a horse adorned with our house's colors, flanked by hand-picked guards, I rode in silence down the road that wound beyond the limits of the only universe I'd ever known. Each hoofbeat against the earth felt like a countdown, echoing within me a premonition I couldn't name, but that chilled me to the core. The people lining the road watched with hollow eyes, without the enthusiasm of times past, without the joyful greetings that once filled the air with reverence. In their place was a tense silence, so thick it was almost tangible. And as I passed those guarded faces, I realized, for the first time, truly, that there were deep cracks beneath the surface of the kingdom I was trained to protect. We rode, for hours, the day aging above our heads, painting the sky a weary gold when the attack came. There was no announcement, no warning. One moment the world was only the sound of galloping hooves, the rustle of cloaks in the wind. The next, it was torn apart by shouts, steel clashing, dust and chaos. My horse reared and I fought to hold steady as I saw the guards, so confident, moments before, caught off guard by figures emerging from the trees, dressed in rough clothing, armed with fierce determination. I was pulled from the saddle before I could react, my hands grasping at air for something I couldn't find. I hit the hard ground, the impact stealing the breath from my lungs, and before I could rise, firm hands pinned me, sharp words cutting through the air. But what struck me most wasn't the violence. It was the gaze of the man who stared at me with eyes so intense they seemed to see through the layers of silk, jewels, and lies that cloaked me. They didn't treat me with the brutality I expected. There was no humiliation, no promises of pain. I was taken prisoner with a strange dignity, as if my capture was a bitter necessity, not a trophy. They led me through dense forest to a makeshift camp hidden among silent hills. The smell of smoke, earth, and sweat filled the air, and for a moment I wished it were all a nightmare from which I could wake. Back was placed in a simple tent, far from the camp's center, watched discreetly but not chained, as if they knew the real prison was something else. The unknown, the uncertainty, the fear of what would become of me. That first night, lying on a rough blanket, the smell of smoke permeating everything, I couldn't close my eyes. I could hear the rebels' murmurs in the distance, their dry laughter, conversations punctuated by the crackle of burning wood. And more than the cold cutting my skin or the exhaustion weighing my limbs, what kept me awake was the brutal realization that for the first time, no one saw me as a princess. I was just a young woman, lost among men and women who wouldn't bow to crowns or surnames. In the days that followed, I was treated with a harsh courtesy, not the tedious deference I was used to, but something almost more humbling, acceptance, without idolatry, without interest, without fear. Among them, no one seemed impressed by my titles. No one made ceremonies to please me. I was merely an inconvenient presence, tolerated more out of necessity than desire. And slowly, as time stretched, around me like invisible ropes I began to observe. I saw how they shared the little they had, how they laughed even under the constant threat of destruction, how they helped each other without the obligation of the cold courtesies I knew so well. I saw calloused men kneel to teach a child how to tie a worn shoe. I saw women bearing the scars of war in their arms, yet still finding room for affection and hope, and inevitably I saw the one who led without needing to shout, the man with keen eyes and calloused hands, whose presence shifted the air without need for crowns or gleaming swords. It was to him that eyes turned in moments of doubt. It was his voice that cut through fear when it threatened to swallow them all. He didn't look at me as a bargaining chip or a threat. He looked at me as if expecting something I didn't even know I had to give. It wasn't pity. It wasn't hatred. It was something harder to bear, the silent expectation that, even fallen, I could still choose what kind of woman I would be. And it was there, amid the dust, the harsh heat of campfires, and the hoarse songs whispered at night, that I grasped an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps the rebels weren't the monsters I'd been taught to fear. Perhaps the real danger had never been outside the palace walls, but within them. And perhaps, just perhaps, the freedom I dreamed of in silent nights wasn't hidden behind thrones and alliances, but here, where every breath was a choice and every step a revolution. At first, our interactions were brief, measured, cloaked in a cold respect, like the morning dew settling over the camp. He, whom I would come to know as Kalen, spoke little to me. When he did, his words were direct, without flourish, as if there was no room between us for the pleasantries that once suffocated me at court. It was strange, almost unsettling, to be treated as someone expected to think, decide, respond, not just obey or charm. In his gray, weary eyes, I saw neither reverence nor blind rejection, but a kind of silent waiting, as if he knew my presence, my existence as the daughter of who I was a living provocation, not because he hated me, but because I represented what he and his people had sworn to topple. The days dragged in the rhythm of a simple, raw life, helping organize supplies, learning to tend wounds, sharing meager meals around campfires. I watched, Kaelin like one watches a storm about to form, not out of fear, but from the certainty that once it broke, nothing would remain the same. He was made of stone and wind, scars and unspoken promises, and every gesture carried a story I didn't yet know, but felt in the undercurrents of his presence. There was a hardness in him that wasn't cruel, a firmness that didn't need shouts to be heard. When he passed, men straightened, conversations paused, and even the night seemed to hush to listen. And against all the logic still trying to hold me captive, I began to want to understand that world. I began to see the wounded hands weaving baskets, the shoulders marked by broken chains, the eyes that shone with defiance, even knowing death could claim them at any moment. I saw, more than that there was nobility in those dust-stained faces, a nobility truer than any lineage written on gilded parchment. And at the center of it all, Kaelin, with his silence, his veiled pain, and his calm strength, became the anchor of a new understanding growing within me, that perhaps the blood I was taught to value never defined honor. Perhaps true greatness was born from the courage to remain whole when the world insists on breaking you. It wasn't a grand gesture that changed the course of things between us. It was something small. A gaze held too long, a question asked without words, a brief touch as he helped me carry a heavy crate, where his fingers brushed mine for a moment that felt longer than any speech. There were no promises, no vows. But with each day, each small shared moment, something invisible wove between us like roots growing silently beneath hardened earth. I began to seek him without realizing it, to measure time not by the court, bells that once marked my duties, but by the moments our presences shared the same space. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of battles beyond the flesh, battles of faith, loss, hopes many would deem impossible. And listening to him, I began to see how my own story had been written by hands that weren't mine. It wasn't just Kaelin transforming me. It was everything. It was the freedom hovering in the air between the tents, the suffocating absence of privileges that, paradoxically, let me breathe easier. It was the way the people there looked at me, expecting me to be more than an ornament, more than a gilded signature on an empty treaty. Every conversation I overheard around the campfires, every laugh that bloomed despite scarcity, carved in me the certainty that I could no longer return to being the pristine princess who left the palace with a head full of orders and a soul empty of itself. Kaelin, unlike the men I knew at court, never tried to mold me. He never shielded me from the world's ugliness or seduced me with sweet words. He was simply there, whole, true, with his firm convictions and silent pain. And perhaps that was exactly what drew me to him. The sense that, with him, I could exist without masks, without the weight of representing something greater than my own soul. Every chance encounter, every exchanged glance, every shared silence by the campfire became a thread, pulling me away from who I'd been, stitching a new skin onto me. A skin that didn't shine like court silks, but was strong, real, untamed. And so, without realizing, without planning, I began to lose myself, or perhaps to find myself, in that camp of tattered tents and insurgent hearts, beside a man who never asked anything of me, but with his mere presence showed me all I could be. The news hit the camp like an arrow lodged in wood, without warning, without mercy. My father's army was marching north, and with it came the promise of destruction. The negotiation, always a farce staged to buy time, now revealed its true face. It was the final siege. And amid the tension rising like a storm about to break, my name surfaced in their strategies, not as a daughter to be saved, but as a disposable coin, a sacrificial piece. To them, I was merely collateral damage. The blood I carried so often, exalted, was now dead weight in the hands of the king who called me daughter. And in that moment, with a clarity so brutal it nearly brought me to my knees, I understood. I was never anyone's hope. I was just another wall propping up a crumbling palace. Kaelin was the one who brought me the decision that would tear apart what remained of my soul. There was a chance, slim, desperate, to escape before the war erupted fully. I could leave, return to my lands, to the cold safety of the palace, to a life of silence and gold. I could wash my hands of it all, betray, the trusting eyes now turning to me among the tents, seeking confirmation that I was one of them. But there was another choice. To stay and face the world as it was, without the shield of my name, without guarantees, without promises. To stay beside people who had nothing to offer but their raw souls and immortal determination. To stay with him. That night, alone under a sky so vast it seemed ready to swallow me, I walked to the camp's edge, where the dark forest stretched like an offering of escape. My feet sank into the damp earth. The wind cut my skin, and within me a battle raged fiercer than any army could muster. I thought of all I'd leave behind, the safety, the blood, the legacy that wasn't mine but had been forced upon me like invisible armor. I thought, too, of what I could gain. Not an easy new life, not a fairy tale story, but something far rarer, the ownership of my own destiny. And when at last I turned my back on the road that would take me back, when I took my first step toward the flickering campfires and the faces marked by struggle, I knew there was no return. For the first time in my life, I was no one's daughter, no one's promise. I was just Ysolde, made of flesh, blood, and choice. My choice. In the gray dawn of that morning, I felt the chill of change slice the horizon, not like a raging gale, but like a sharp blade, slow, inevitable. The camp was in motion, every face carrying the silent gravity of those who know that in a few hours they might be only a memory. I donned the simple tunic they offered, slipped on worn boots, and with still trembling hands, tied an improvised belt around my waist. There were no jewels, no scepters, no trace of the heritage once hung on my shoulders like golden shackles. There was only the raw truth of my fragile body and my hardened spirit, and the unshakable certainty that I had chosen to be there. Kaelin saw me as I crossed the camp toward the preparations. He said nothing. He didn't smile. He didn't question. He merely tilted his head slightly, a gesture so small and yet so immense it nearly broke my chest. In that gesture was acceptance, respect, and the silent promise that, whatever happened from then on, I wouldn't walk alone. I trained as best I could in the hours before the confrontation, my hands, accustomed to quills and papers, now trying to grasp the weight of a bow, the resistance of a dagger. My body protested, my mind screamed, but my heart was silently steady, as if it had waited for this moment my entire life. Every command I learned, every hard look I received from the more skeptical rebels was taken as a harsh baptism, a necessary purification to shed, once and for all, the shadow of the girl I'd been. When the news came that my father's army was near, that the dust of their troops could already be seen rising on the horizon, I felt fear try to take root in me. But this time, instead of retreating, instead of hiding behind excuses or illusions, I embraced it. I welcomed fear as part of my newfound humanity. And there, amid the smell of wet earth, the heat of hastily doused campfires, and the tense hum of arrows being prepared, I realized Courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was moving forward despite it, and I would move forward. The first arrow sliced the sky like a ragged scream, and the world exploded into motion. There was no more time for doubts, regrets, or nostalgia for a life of marble and silence. There was only the present, wild, brutal, honest. I ran through burning tents, the smell of smoke and hot iron filling my lungs, as the sound of shouts and clashing swords vibrated in my bones. I saw faces I'd come to recognize, men and women who had shared bread with me, who had taught me, through their stubborn existence, what it meant to fight, fall in the dust without ceremony, without heroism, only with the hard reality of loss. My hand trembled around the makeshift bow, my fingers burning from inexperience, but still, when I saw a soldier advance toward a child hiding under a broken cart, my legs moved before reason could stop them. I loosed the arrow without thinking, feeling the taut creak of wood against my palm, and though the shot wasn't perfect, it was enough to divert the attacker's attention. My heart pounded so fast I thought it would tear through my chest, but within that desperation was also a raw strength, the strength of someone who, for the first time, knew exactly what they were defending. Between one charge and another, I saw Kalen, his steady figure moving through the field like an anchor amid the chaos. His eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, and in that look was everything: command, faith, recognition. I was no longer the hostage of noble blood. No longer the decorative princess. I was one of us, and that, I realized, was worth more than any crown they could place on my head. The battle seemed to drag on for an eternity, and at the same time burn out in the blink of an eye. Every blow, every fall, every scream was a verdict carved into flesh and soul. Fear still lived in me, pulsing like an open wound, but now it was fuel, not a chain. When the clangor of war finally began to fade, when the sounds became distant murmurs and the smell of churned earth filled the air, I was there, standing exhausted, filthy with blood and dust, but irrevocably alive, and I knew in that moment, suspended between loss and victory, that I had passed through the fire, and I had forged myself whole. The battlefield fell silent under the weight of morning. The sun, timid, began to rise on the horizon, gilding the smoldering wreckage, the still bodies, the deep footprints in the mud. I walked among the survivors, each step heavy, as if the earth claimed my presence, my guilt, my belonging. I saw faces smiling through tears, hands clasped over wounds, the bitter price of freedom etched into every piece of the devastated landscape. And amid it all, I felt a thread of something new stretching within me, not naive hope nor foolish euphoria, but a strong, vibrant calm, like the earth after a storm. Kalen found me near the stream where we used to fetch water in those early days, when my presence was still a question hanging in the air. Now, there were no more questions, only the silent certainty of what we were and what we had built, stone by stone, choice by choice, fall by fall. He didn't speak. He simply approached, his shadow merging with mine, as if together we were more solid than we could ever be apart. And for the first time, there was no need for words between us. Everything had already been said in the steps we'd taken to get there, the fears we'd faced, the losses we'd endured. I breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill my battered lungs, and looked around. The old life, the empty promises, the forced duties, the invisible chains, seemed so distant now, so fragile in the face of the reality before my eyes. I was no longer a princess, no longer the heir to titles that meant nothing in the face of the dignity of choice. I was Ysolde Fairmoor, and that was enough. In the silence broken only by the murmur of water and the slow whisper of wind through the shattered trees, I extended my hand to Kalen. He took it with that firm, discreet strength that had always been his mark. And together we took the first step beyond the battlefield, not toward a grandiose victory, nor a fairy tale ending, but toward a life that would be built each day, with truth, with struggle, with love unbound by chains. And in that moment, among the ruins of what was, something new was born, something entirely ours. Some scars never fade, nor should they. I carry the marks of that battlefield, the memories of the faces lost, the choices that shaped my path. But I carry something even stronger, the memory of who I became when I finally dared to choose for myself. I am not the shadow of a throne, nor the heir to broken promises. I am made of the dust that withstood the wind, the strength that grew in adversity, the love that was born without asking permission. And as long as there is a road beneath my feet, as long as the horizon calls my name, I will know I lived. I chose.